This episode is dedicated to my children, the memory of Elizabeth Suzanne Delaney Hess, Pat Day, and Colonel Ed Freely of the Royal British Army. Some time ago, my family asked me, why does Germany have so many castles? They seem to ask me all these kinds of questions. I guess it's because I'm the dad. So it's an interesting question. So is it true? Because when you think about it, castles are found all over Western literature and media. So one could ask, why is this? So therefore, why am I chewing on this question as a result? I'm not a historian in the professional sense of the word. Well, over 20 years ago, when I was in the Western Civilization class at Santa Barbara City College, summer school, when Dr. Christopher Mooney, the professor, an Irishman, was explaining the concept of chivalry, using the overture of William Tell to illustrate his point, he anointed a classmate who was Elizabeth Suzanne Delaney Hess back then. Elizabeth Delaney. It's, by the way, the full name is an iambic pentameter. And I, as Countess of Santa Barbara and Sir Paul of Goleta Valley, respectively. So imagine this: having a history professor who basically says, let's see, you're from here, you're from here. Okay, so I know you as the Countess and you as her liege, the Sir Paul of Goleta Valley. What? The theme song from the Lone Ranger? Thinking more about this, I realized chivalry, it became a thing between the late 12th and early 13th century AD. And even though while William Tell or Guillaume Tell in French or in the German, it's a Wilhelm Tell, it was part of the 14th century kind of a thing. It seems like Rossini, when he composed the overture, a couple centuries. Close! Let's think about the castle. So, what defines a castle? Using the Oxford Dictionary, it's really a large building, typically of the medieval period, that was fortified, defended, if you will, against attacks from adversaries and so forth, using thick walls, battlements, towers, and in many cases a moat. So this sounds a lot like blah 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 blah, or to borrow a quote from a Hungarian colleague of mine, Miklos Szilágyi, hola 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 hola. This basically what it really means is castles were really meant to basically defend what you got and discourage others from trying to take what you got in the end. And the original credit for the concept of the castle really goes to the Normans. The Normans, they really get the overall credit for this with their invention, if you will, of the Montebello structure. It became very popular after William the Conqueror, a Norman, invaded England in 1066 AD. The English Windsor Castle, as of today, is one example of a Montebello from a structural point of view, not necessarily from how things were built back then, because nowadays the castle doesn't look anything like what a Montebello would have looked like back then. So for the educators out there who want to reach out to the gaming generation, I know this is a little bit dated, but this is the best thing I could think of. The concept of the castle, Montebello, it's also featured in a Sierra online game called Lord of Realms 2. And if you're interested, this game also shows different ways you can use Wooden Palisade, Norman Keep, and two other types of castles. Thinking about castles and how they apply today. So what are the aspects of castles that are really accentuated, popularized in today's media? If you think about fairy tales, any stories that you find in Disneyland, for example, thanks to the Neuschwanstein, it's not necessarily what makes castles impressive in terms of defense, but it's about what makes the castles, from a subjective, artistic point of view, pretty and somewhat, enchanting, if you will. When you go to Normandy, yes, where the Normans, where they got their start, you look at Mont Saint Michel. That's one place where, yep, the castle's still there, isolated by water. Other castles that you find popularized in media, you find Glamis, Windsor, Château de Chambord. Did I say that properly? C'est bon. Prague Castle. These are very breathtaking castles, but they're not necessarily good for defense these days. Shakespeare. By the way, I'm not a fiction fan because real life is much more fascinating, but I have to give credit where it's due. Shakespeare, in his play regarding Henry V, as he actually used the Kenilworth Castle as one example of where Henry V, as he had celebrated his victory, acknowledged certain things with respect to the Battle of Agincourt. You also find examples of a Danish castle called the Kronborg Castle in the play called Hamlet, and yes, Stirling Castle in Macbeth, as well as A Midsummer Night's Dream. American movies often depict castles as being from another country. So, for example, let's see, Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail. I fought in the general direction. Castles such as Blarney, Tower of London. Technically, it is a castle, and Leeds, actually owned by an American these days. They're referenced even in children's books such as Richard Scarry's Busy Town series. Chateau de Hautefort was featured in Ever After, the 1998 movie. I think that was a movie with Dougray Scott and Drew Barrymore. Okay, close enough for me. Bohemian castles still are found in the Czech Republic, such as the one in Prague, as well as in Český Krumlov. Germany, technically Bavaria in Bavarians' minds, has a Neuschwanstein castle that heavily influenced Disneyland's Sleeping Beauty castle design. By the way, castles, as far as concepts go, they're not just British/European landmarks. Japan is also famous for its Osaka and Matsumoto Castle too. Think about the originators of these castles. The concept of Motte and Bailey. Who were these Normans? History shows that these people, they were a byproduct of social contact between the Vikings, aka the Norsemen, the Gauls/Romans, and the Franks who settled around in modern-day Normandy. So therefore, the Normans popularized the use of Motte and Bailey. What other countries built them or the follow-on castles for defense purposes? And who made these castles? There are many metrics out there which some historian, hey Brian Davenport, this is your opportunity, could easily spend another 100 pages just looking into, writing about, and hopefully getting some other society to basically pay the research costs associated with this. I'm too lazy for that. Looking at Ratio's point of view, Germany is estimated to have 20,000, both intact and also in ruins, castles, for its landmass of about 357,000 square kilometers. That does seem like a lot, especially when you look at how France has 6,000 castles for its landmass. So if we were to just look at a ratio point of view, Germany has one castle for 18 square kilometers. Czech Republic, okay, the Bohemians, if you will, it's 1 to 88. France, 1 to 92. Britain, 1 to 162. Spain, another empire, 1 to 202. Poland, well, I have Polish relatives. I have to give them, give the culture some acknowledgement whenever I can. For the sake of fairness, 1 to 625. Japan, as of today, is 1 to 3,780 square kilometers, although back in the day it used to be 1 to 76. I'll get to this in a little bit later on. I have not taken into account China and Russia in this analysis. It's not fair game. Think about it. A good portion of the landmass are either a desert, aka the Gobi, or tundra, Siberia, as popularized by an Estonian TV show called Tu Yurikpuria and its Kuidetamine episode. So, castles. Who would want to build them, and why? Think about it. They're really built for defense from competing powers, and hopefully housing all the people from the lands, the serfs, during sieges, yes, plural. Hopefully the castle had access to running water, which is not a guarantee. Keep in mind that running water the Romans had the idea as part of their aqueducts, but it never became, widespread until modern plumbing became a thing in the late 1800s. Dr. Craig Freudenreich did an analysis regarding the castle and its construction, and he estimated that it took anywhere between 2 to 10 years to build one. Back in the day, it was an art. There were no modern machines, so stones, they had to be red, so that the stonemasons, they could just find the natural breaking as the breaking planes, aka the cleave planes. Thank you, the Dr. not Dr. Mr. Reese Williams from Earth Science Days. So these masons, they had to just find which way the stones would naturally cleave, so that they could just take the chisel, tap tap tap, and the stones would break in a specific direction. And if you think, let's say, modern technology has changed all the stuff, not really, because think about diamonds. You ever have to wonder why diamonds are so expensive? It's not necessarily, let's see, the raw gems that you find in the mines somewhere. They still need to be broken down, polished, assessed to see how it should be cut, because not all diamonds are necessarily made in the same way, because not all diamonds are 100% carbon. People, if you ever wonder what makes diamonds give off the different pretty colors, it's not the carbons. It's actually all the different impurities, metals, or they're called occlusions in gemology, in that terms, that basically makes these things either give off different kinds of color lights or make it be fluorescent. Thank you, impurities. And let's see, the reason why jewelers have to take a long time to make sure that the angle that they're using for chiseling is just right, because if they don't, the whole thing's going to shatter. And diamonds, you have to just hit them just right in order for the diamond facet to break off cleanly, because of its adamantane, or its carbon-to-carbon structure. Thanks to Dr. Stan Anderson from Inorganic Chemistry Days for this tidbit. King Edward I nearly bankrupted the royal treasury for his castle construction in Wales. Imagine nearly bankrupting your national or your royal treasury just for the sake of building one castle in Wales. By the way, this is a continuous theme, as I will explain later on. You also need castles, as I previously stated, to defend your lands when threats are close by. So Germany, as we know it, became a federated republic in 1990 with 16 states. Over history, the lands kept changing hands between various powers. Bohemia, when you think about it, was relatively impacted compared to Germany, which helps to explain why Bohemia really didn't have as much need to have defensive structures as much as the lands that make up to the modern-day Germany do. Look at France. Thanks to King Philip Augustus and onward, has been pretty steady as far as lands go. By the way, the German word for France is Frankreich, which literally translates into Frankish/French realm, which means that France was an empire and stayed relatively an empire. For most of its history. So its lands really didn't have face the kinds of threats, external threats, immediate threats, as other smaller principalities did. By the way, the Estonian word for Germany is Saksamaa. Think Saxony, a northeastern German state closest to Estonian. So these powers, they really built them because they had to, not because it was a good way to show off their riches. I'll cover that a little bit later on. So why did Germany, or principalities that eventually ended up in the Federal Republic at least, build up to 20,000 castles? Let's think about this. Unlike France, Spain, and England, the lands where Germany is today was actually made up of various competing principalities. That was often either a goal or part of the trek towards some other empires as far as competing powers were concerned. The principalities not only had local neighbors to contend with, but were often pawns in bigger political chess games, thanks to Charlemagne and his Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, and other limited families yielding quasi-inbreedings between ruling families. The Germany part of Europe had lots of natural resources too. Think hills, climate, that yielded a lot of production for a given square kilometer, making the lands a popular tourist attraction for invading armies. Thank you, Kaidovair, for this quote regarding Livonia. Tananvaga. So because Germany historically has been not a united state, but it's been a mess of the different competing principalities that often exchange hands between the French speakers, the Prussians, and so forth. If Chesty Puller went to German lands before the formation of the Weimar Republic, he also would have said something along the lines of, "We are surrounded by the enemy. That simplifies the problem." So if castles were built for defense, then why are castles popular in media today all about the architecture, art, and beauty/charm? Okay, castles prior to 100 year war in Europe didn't have water-based plumbing and didn't have guaranteed water sources. Was a big risk for the castle occupants when the enemy used mangonels. Mangonels, by the way, they're like catapults, except they're designed to hurl, let's see, hurl things over slightly shorter distances. By the way, the word mangonel is derived from a Latin word that describes the visual of a donkey or mule kicking. I challenge you to look it up. So whenever the enemy used mangonels to hurl dead animals over the castle walls into a place where people couldn't go anywhere, and there was no guaranteed access to running water, you were let's see, these castles. It was basically a big target / potential cesspool for biological warfare. You look at Neuschwanstein in Bavaria. It's a pain to hike to, but when you walk into the interior, it is uber gorgeous. It clearly would not last long in a siege after it was built, because it was built in the late 1800s, right around the time of King Ludwig II. Go to England. The Tower of London would have been effective several centuries ago. Not so much today. You go to Normandy. Mont Saint Michel. It was built by the Normans. It was popularized in Disney's Tangled movie. I think it was voiced by Mandy Moore. Right. These castles became popular for other reasons besides its original Oxford Dictionary definition. They essentially evolved to be treated with characteristics similar to what palaces have. Speaking of palaces, a palace is defined also by the Oxford Dictionary as being the official home of a king, queen, president, etc., dictators, and so forth. Think Nicolae Sescu in Romania. Yes, it's still a sore topic to this day. In practice, palaces were a good excuse for the rulers to show off their wealth, or in modern day terminology, and I may be slightly dated here, their bling. This was a bigger deal. This was a really a bigger, a more prominent feature that you found in empires that had effective order/discipline within its territories. Look at China, the forbidden city. That's one big palace with big city walls. Even if the leaders didn't have the money, remember my note about King Edward I? Some tended to get loans to build their quasi-palaces, such as King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He really hurt Bavaria's fortunes a lot with respect to his vision for building the Neuschwanstein castle, which actually wasn't finished before he died. So when did the castles stop being used for their original purpose? Because times change, and and when times change, things must either adapt or they stop as being taken care of, and they are left to rot altogether. Metallurgy and artillery advancements during the Hundred Years' War in Europe helped make castles essentially ineffective. Before this, if you think about it, it was basically hurling stones with catapults towards bigger stones. But then when you think about density, once Europeans got metallurgy up to a certain standard, people were able to hurl big metal balls. They were of a higher density, so they could basically hurl smaller metal balls to basically knock out stone walls. And also with the advent of gunpowder, eventually over longer distances, outside the reach of the castle archers, even longbow archers too. Popular castles, well, at least the restored ones, are known for their art slash beauty slash spookiness in media. Let's think about spookiness. Think about the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the castle that actually inspired the setting behind this novel. There's actually a Frankenstein castle in Germany. I think it's about 1 hour south of somewhere of the Autobahn 6. Castles famous for their artistic factors were often either refurbished or repurposed for a different purpose in the end. So are castles purely a Norman invention? From a timing point of view, you could make an argument, yes. However, Japan had them, let's see, several hundred years ago too. They were really big during the times when you had different warlords who basically maintained their own lands, and they were constantly competing, let's see, with other warlords either for expansion or for something else. And because Japan, with the various shogunates who basically united Japan, the need for castles became a lot less territory-wise, and this is why Japan has a lot less castles today intact than back in the heyday. America technically has them. Think about the Hearst Castle, but that's really a Hearst palace from a function point of view. All you need to do is to bring a howitzer, not even with ammo, within 10 miles, and someone from the castle will be screaming, "No, no, no, no." Not a typical no. Think about the movie called The Analyze This. It was a movie with Billy Crystal and Robert De Niro. And think about the exchange between the couple/don, depending on if you're from the North or South Italy, and the shrink. You don't hear the word no very often, do you? I hear it all the time. It's more like, no, please, no, no! So what have I learned after doing all this research? I've learned a lot, actually. And my kids will be so sorry once I give the answers to them. Castles for defense today, they're not really noteworthy, except for Heidelberg Castle, for example. It was a castle that was burned during the War of Palatine Succession, but the 4-story wine barrel is still there. Go check it out. It's quite impressive. The U.S. Army's Engineer Corps insignia is a castle. Although the U.S. didn't have any reasons to build things that royalty tended to favor, think about the movie called Naked Gun with Leslie Nielsen, where Frank Drebin is at the City Hall scene giving a speech about protecting the Queen. Although the idea of a queen may seem silly to us, as Americans we must be gracious hosts. The Engineer Corps specializes today in building defenses and traps. Just like castle walls, moats, and wherever the servants dumped out the chamber pots. Go look it up. There has to be a Geneva Convention violation somewhere here. Now that's paying homage to military engineers and their historical origins, which is paying homage to tradition. That's right, tradition, unlike the US Air Force, which has habits. But at least the US Army remains more flexible compared to the US Navy, because the Navy has 200 plus years of tradition unimpeded by progress. Castles popularized in modern media were built as quasi-palaces. If you look at Mont Saint-Michel today, for example, the castle that inspired a few scenes within the Tangled Disney animated movie, it's actually owned by some rich people. So therefore, it's really pretty. The Vikings, once again, just like with the Hanseatic League or Hansatal, they influenced Europe and its fairy tales too. Empires that are secure don't need castles. Look at China. So the lands that make up modern-day Germany had lots of insecurity related issues to hash out from political, military, economic points of view. And from an external point of view, it almost seems like Europeans were infatuated with wars compared to the Russians and the Chinese. 7 Years' War, 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War? That's like 4 or 5 generations worth of people who are working on the same set of conflicts. Lack of security, such as what you have found in the lands that make up Germany today, essentially leads to innovation. So why did the Europeans invent guns, even though the Chinese invented gunpowder long ago? For the answer, I challenge you to look up a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, written by Jared Diamond. By the way, I also realized that diamonds are not forever, because diamonds, the adamantine structure of its carbons, they are thermodynamically unstable. In other words, they want to break apart naturally. Yet, the rate of breaking apart, it is so slow, it's known to have the slowest kinetic rate. I think it's like 10,000 years or something like that. So it seems like it's forever for a lifetime, but over the long haul, no, it's not forever. Gioacchino Rossini, an Italian composer, with his overture of William Tell, he probably didn't know it, helped make Looney Tunes, The Lone Ranger, Hi-ho, Silver, and some commercials in America very famous. Very, very famous. Tutto bene. Alright, it's time for the Kevin Bacon game. Keeping in mind that, let's see, there's a lot of history here. All castles' origins lead to Rome. With the word palace being derived from a Roman word, even though the Vikings started the castle trend back in 1066 AD, most number of castles that have palace attributes, in other words, the bling factors, ended up in Germany, thank you Bavaria, by 4 degrees of separation. The world has Rome to thank for popular castles and classical music in Germany. Thanks again for listening. If you want to subscribe, that's great. However, as if you would like to leave a constructive feedback regarding what topics I should explore, have at it. See you next time.